Buenas tardes, estimados alumnos. Me da mucho gusto estar con ustedes por estos pocos momentos que vamos a estar juntos por medio de este video. Good evening or afternoon, my wonderfully esteemed students, depending on the time you view this video. It brings me great pleasure to be with you all for the next few moments. We're going to be together. Yes, there's no need to adjust your monitors or your screens. This is Mr. Incredible. And I am going to bless you with a lecture on something called the Intercultural Developmental Inventory. There's no need to stress. I got the guns and the knowledge to get us through this. Okay, I guess I should take my mask off now. I know many of you were probably going to ask for my autograph because you thought I was Mr. Incredible, but no, it's Mr. Deficient. It's Dr. Reyes. All right, I hope we're going into this next week, and I just wanted to provide you all a very brief overview of an idea, of a concept, of a framework for understanding some of the cultural differences that we're going to be exploring relative to our schooling systems and relative to our positionalities and the positionalities and experiences of our students in our schools. Okay, so let me begin. This is really important for everybody to understand. Okay, what I want everyone to know is that just right off the bat, that the work of a teacher is to cultivate, genuinely care, and invest themselves in the lives and the development and growth of their children, of their students. Okay, and you know, to use the garden analogy from one of my wonderfully esteemed colleagues, you know, each classroom that you have is a garden, and you don't get to choose the plants that are in that garden, right? That's not part of the project that you have as the master gardener in that space. Your job as the gardener is to care for and tend to the plants in the garden, you know, and you could consider that these plants are coming in, and your job is to love on them. Your job is to nurture them. Your job is to care for them. Your job is to ultimately provide them with the conditions that are going to be most conducive to their growth and to their development into the best versions of themselves that they're capable of being in the 186, 189 days we have with them as teachers. Now, I will, sticking with that analogy, I will share that, you know, some of us have more cacti in our gardens. Some of us have a couple of roses, beautiful roses. Some of us have plants that you really can't get too close to because you're going to get stuck, right? You're going to get pricked by them. If you have a cacti, you know, it has different needs than a rose does, and it has different needs than a sunflower. But the really key important part of this whole lecture is your job as a teacher is to care for those plants. You don't want those plants to wither. You don't want those plants to recede into themselves. You don't want them to be stunted in their growth. And I think if you keep that analogy at the forefront of your mind, your students will be better served, your craft will be better served, your practice will be better served, and I think you'll be able to sleep better at night. And so that being said, that's kind of that's the orientation I take into my classroom, not just with students when I was in the K through 12 system, and not just with students in the college system, but even now in working with you all, it's the same mentality I have. You know, I have plants that require different things, and my job as a gardener is to care for them. So what I'm going to do today is provide you all with a brief overview of something called the Intercultural Developmental Continuum, or the Intercultural Developmental Inventory. And what this is basically it's a survey of sorts, a number of different questions that a person can take and respond to in this survey, and then ultimately get a sense of where they are relative to cultural differences and sensitivity to cultural differences. Okay. The really important part too, I think, for me in sharing this lecture is I want you all to know that wherever you are is a product of your socialization. It's a product of your life experiences. It's a product of the insulation or exposure you've had to cultural differences that perhaps have shaped your orientation and your understanding of things. But wherever you are is where you are. And there's no value judgments in that. You know, as a teacher, my job is to value you where you are, because all of us had no say in where we were born. No say in the time we were born, no say into who our parents are going to be, into the racial or ethnic group, the socioeconomic background, the sexual, all of those different things are part and parcel of our identity and our positionalities. And so as you go into these conversations that are going to be relatively challenging to some degree, I want you all to know that I honor your truth, and I honor it because that's where you are. My job isn't to to um, to make people change their minds about any of these issues, but to actually have some clarity about what they understand and what they know, and then use that knowledge and that understanding to improve the conditions for learning for their students and for teaching for themselves and for the lives and experiences other people have with them. Okay. So that's a really important part of this. I don't want people crafting answers because they think there's a right answer or an answer that other people want to hear or that I will want to hear. The only correct answer is the answer that you are able to present truthfully, that truthfully and honestly reflects what you think. And part of a college experience, and many of you already have advanced degrees and some of you don't necessarily, but the really important part about this that I think as a teacher is not just to value and care for your students and invest in them and nurture them and cultivate their growth and development like a plant, but it's to help our students find their voice, right? Like you're going to find throughout the quarter, I'm asking you, what do you think? What do you feel? How do you feel? How does this make you feel? What do you think of this? Because the first part of acquiring an education is being able to find your voice. Like, what do you have to say about this? And then the second part about this is hopefully cultivating the wisdom, right? The understanding that's necessary to know when to use your voice. Because right now we have a lot of voices being just screaming at each other in our culture, in our political environment. We need individuals to be able to have the wisdom to know when to use their voice. When will it be most effectual? When will it be most effective? When will it be most conducive to the growth and the nurturing and the cultivation of another human being? Okay. And it all sounds very philosophical and very flowery, but I genuinely mean that, and as a professor of color teaching this to a historically predominantly white population, it's a really challenging class. And I think sometimes students have misconceptions about what my role is. And my role is not necessarily to hear an echo chamber or create an echo chamber of help people, to help care for my students in ways that allow them to find value in their voice and in the voices of other people. And in doing so, hopefully improving the learning conditions and the relationships that they have with the people around them in our schools, which have historically been sites of conflict and hostility towards difference. Whether that difference is related to special education, sexual orientation, racial differences, socioeconomic differences. Those schools, our schools have been political sites of battleground, cultural war, right? Cultural differences. Okay, so what do they call it? They call it the cultural wars, I think is what they call it, right? So that being said, that's the first thing I want you all to kind of see. I value where you are, and I value where all of you are, because that is where life has brought you. Okay. Now I'm going to explain the IDI. I'm going to call it the IDI. It says IDC right there, but it's the same kind of thing. What you're looking at here is a measure of your sensitivity to the cultural differences that you have, right? And so it goes from a monocultural mindset to an intercultural mindset. And what you could also look at it as an ethnocentric to a pluralistic mindset, okay? And one of the things that I want you all again to realize is that your position in this or on this spectrum, on this continuum, is really just a product of your insulation or exposure to various types of cultural differences. Okay, so we have about 3% of the population. Now, this survey has been administered to hundreds of thousands of people probably by now. It's been around for quite some time. Some of you may already know about it. Some of you may not. But the idea is that after you take this, you get a sense of where you are. So after all of these hundreds of thousands of surveys have been administered, we generally have about 3% of the population in denial of those cultural differences. That is, they don't see those cultural differences at all, okay? And it's really rooted in an insulation that doesn't allow them and hasn't allowed them to be exposed to the types of cultural differences that are out there relative to sexual orientation, relative to gender, relative to race, relative to socioeconomic status, et cetera, right? Usually those cultural differences are most salient. Um, so this is a person that is, to use the next slide, this is a person that if you're thinking about it from race, what race problem? I don't have a problem with that. Or I have nothing to do with that. Or a sexism problem. What sexism? I don't have anything to do with sexism. Or what homophobia? I don't have anything to do with homophobia. A great part of this is because these individuals have been insulated from exposure to members of that population or that group that they're in denial about. If you're really, really wealthy, homelessness isn't a problem for you because where you live in a gated community, for example, you don't see the homelessness. The only time you bump into homelessness is going to be in some other context. And even then, you probably have the power and the privilege to be able and the resources to be able to insulate yourself from even that. You can probably drive down safer streets or enter only communities that are wealthy and affluent. Okay. So, and the same thing with race or sexual orientation or even sometimes gender. All right. Now, about 15% of the population is in polarization. Now, polarization is where you have an ethnocentric judgment call on the cultural difference. So the person in polarization, about 15% of the population, sees cultural differences, unlike the person in denial. And they say, well, that's interesting. Also, African Americans have problems with the police. Why don't you just do what the police say, right? You make judgment calls on that. For example, you look at sexual orientation, and a person in polarization may say, "Oh, I see there are lesbians or bisexual individuals or gay individuals. Why don't they just stop being gay, or why don't they just stop being lesbians?" It's a person that judges the difference from their value system. Okay, a person in polarization may look at um, a person in poverty and say, why don't they just work harder? Or a homeless person, like, why don't they just stop using drugs? Right? Basically, it's predicated on this image or this understanding of the situation, the positionality that ultimately frames that positionality in some way that's usually a deficit frame, right? So um, there's also, when you look at and I'm going to try to make this as quickly as I can. Now, polarization does have, as this slide mentions, it does have two stages. And that's related to whether or not you're a member of a dominant group or a subordinate population, a minority population. And I won't go into that. You don't need to know necessarily about that, but there is reversal and defense associated with it. That's probably too technical for this brief lecture. But now you have about, I think it's close to 60% of the population. Yeah, close to 60% of the population is in minimization, which is a de-emphasis of the differences between the value or the groups that people are looking at, or the cultural differences that they perceive. So when a person is in minimization, they are aware of those differences and they're trying to de-emphasize the differences that they possess. So if you think about it linguistically, like Mexican Americans who adopt and assimilate to a predominantly English-speaking Anglo culture, they are in minimization. So yo ya no puedo hablar español, no como antes. Español era mi primer idioma y ya que me asimilé, ya no lo puedo hablar igual. Okay, so what I just said was that as a Mexican American, my first language was Spanish, but now that I've assimilated and I've engaged in minimization, I no longer speak Spanish the same. I have very limited exposure to the opportunity to speak Spanish because most of the people I work with are predominantly white and English speakers, and that limits my ability to engage in some of the cultural exchanges that I would have in a more ethnic context. So in minimization, a person is trying to de-emphasize their difference, right? So I'm speaking English to you all because I want to de-emphasize the difference that I have between you all as a racial minority that and really is confronted by linguicism in a lot of different ways. Okay, you could think about it in terms of class as well. So a person in minimization is, if they're in poverty, it's a person who's purchasing clothing that they really shouldn't be spending so much money on. So for example, some poor kid like me, when I was growing up, we would get income tax and I would ask my mom to buy me $300 shoes. Now $300 shoes in 1990 is a lot of money, and we would burn through that income tax. But I was engaged in minimization, buying clothes that are outside of your price range, outside of your income range. Or, for example, a person living in a mobile home or an RV who is driving a $75,000 or $80,000 Buick 300 or Chrysler 300, something to that effect. So you can see minimization in class differences. You can see it in racial differences. You can also see it even in terms of sexual orientation. So historically, a person in minimization relative to sexual orientation could be a person who has not yet come out of the closet, so to speak, as they used to say, and express that they're homosexual, lesbian, bisexual, or gay. So you can look at it in a number of different ways. When you look at it from a race perspective, it's a person that's basically says all lives matter. I don't see color. Now there is a problem with I don't see color, that phrasing, because one of the first things your brain picks up right through your eyes is the salient characteristic of someone's phenotype, someone's skin color. So if a person says they don't see color, subconsciously they don't really understand the science, because the science says that your brain picks up on the color immediately. That's one of the first characteristics your brain identifies to determine whether or not someone or something is a threat to you in an environment, in an ecology. Okay. All right. Now, going up closer to this pluralistic mindset or this intercultural mindset, you have, or multicultural mindset, you could say as well. You've got an acceptance, which is basically a person who does see this difference, doesn't de-emphasize it, doesn't deny it, but actually comprehends those differences and walks towards them, right? So if you think about it in terms of race, it's a person that says, I want to better understand how racism impacts people, or homophobia, or classism and poverty, or sexism, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a person that is walking towards those cultural differences and not pretending they're not there. That's about 15% of the population. And then you also, last but not least, you also have another type of another stage, which is another 3% of the population in the intercultural mindset. And the intercultural mindset, you basically have this this individual who's very fluid and able to navigate these basically these cultural differences in very seamless ways. Okay. Now, if you're looking at it from a race perspective, it's like I see how all these systems operate, and I want to work to dismantle racism, or, for example, sexism, or homophobia, or classism, or poverty, or inequality, or social injustice, right? Something like that. And it's 3% of the population. Now, one thing I will bring to mind is that we don't go from better to worse in this space, okay? We're not making value judgments for someone who's in adaptation being better or superior to someone who's in denial. Because again, like I said, where you are on the continuum is a product of your socialization, your experiences, the resources and the background you have coming into the space and where you are in life. Okay. The other part about this is that's really interesting and distinct about being in adaptation is people in adaptation have a lot of frustration with anybody else that's not where they are. And if you listened intently to what I shared earlier, that's very similar to a person in denial, right? So it's almost like they're so fluid that they're not able to understand or comprehend these other individuals. And it's also why there's only 3% of the population. So a person in adaptation struggles simply because they're so insulated or basically distinct from every other one of the stages. Okay. Now, what I want to do is ask you all to take on a mental exercise really quickly. And based on your experiences, based on the descriptors that I just shared, I'd like to ask you, like, where do you think you are in these spaces? Okay. Where do you think you are in these spaces? Plurality or ethnocentricity or monocultural perspectives. Okay. Take a minute to think through that. And the next thing I want to ask you is, and this is kind of where it gets interesting, okay? Wherever you are is where you are, and there's, like I said, there's no good or bad. Now, one thing I do want to kind of share is that usually the results show that people overestimate their ability and underestimate the complexity of the work. So what I mean by that is when people are surveyed about where they think they are in the continuum, and then they actually get where they are on the results that they have, usually people are about 2 stages behind. So if you believe yourself to be in adaptation, you're probably in minimization. Statistically speaking, that's probably where you're at. Or if you're in acceptance, you're probably in polarization. Or if you're in minimization, you might be even closer to denial. Okay. Now, if you're in denial, I don't know where you are. You're probably in denial, right? But I share that because it should be very humbling to think about that, because as you bump into a number of different perspectives that people are going to be sharing in this class, it's going to be very easy to begin to start shading or throwing judgment on what you see from that person. And I want you all to work towards avoiding that. I want you all to create a sense of community where a plurality of perspectives can be valued. And it's not just the plants in your classroom for, right? When you're in your student teaching or your placement or your practicum, you need to be caring about your cohort, the people in your group, just because they're plants as well. And no plant needs to be stopped. Every plant needs to be cultivated to full growth. Okay. Now, that being said, I will also share that moving forward, that if you are in a stage of denial, the way to break out of that, or the way to move forward from that, is to just begin to expose yourself to some cultural differences. And you can start with some of the very surface kind of culture that is out there. So for example, you can start maybe exposing yourself to different foods, different music, different arts, and perhaps even different types of people. If you're in polarization, you want to really kind of begin to find the commonalities that you share with other people, as opposed to those differences, because those differences are going to stand out very starkly. And try to take a less judgmental stance towards individuals who are different and see things differently from yourself. And then if you're in minimization, which is going to be the great majority of us, right? And it's 65%. I thought it was 60, but it's about 65%. You want to work towards understanding your own self as a cultural being. Okay, you certainly want to look towards, walk towards what power and privileges you possess, and relative to your positionality. And then you want to really kind of begin to explore the cultural frameworks that are out there. And there's really only two. You have communal or collective mindsets, and then you have individualistic mindsets. So most of the Western world, the United States especially, is kind of on an individualistic mindset or framework. But some Western nations like Britain, I'm thinking South Korea, I'm thinking Japan, some other cultures, Eastern Orient cultures also have collectivist mindsets mingled with some individualistic frameworks. So you want to just kind of think about that as you go on. One other thing that I'll share is that, again, there's going to be few opportunities for us to actually engage in real-time conversations, but I really want you to really work on yourselves, even as I'm working on myself here. I really value each and every one of you's perspectives, and I'm looking forward to learning about you and what you all think about the things we're going to be exploring. Have a wonderful week. Please be safe. Okay. Don't hesitate to email me or reach out if you have any questions.